Imagine charging across an open field, the roar of machine guns ripping through the air, artillery shells exploding all around you, and death waiting for every step you take. This is not a scene from a movie, it's World War I, a war that promised. Glory became a nightmare of mud, blood, and endless trenches. How did Europe's greatest armies, trained for movement and victory, end up locked in a frozen battlefield for years? Today, we uncover the shocking truth behind why World War I turned into trench warfare and why it changed the nature of war forever. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will blow your mind. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe believed war would be swift, decisive, and glorious. Soldiers marched to the front with polished boots, brass buttons shining, convinced they would be home by Christmas. Generals studied maps that still remembered the age of Napoleon, an age when bold movement and cavalry charges decided history. But the world they stepped into in 1914 was not the world their doctrines were written for. It was a new industrial age, and it would devour old ideas without mercy. World War I did not begin in trenches. It fell into them when the first shots were fired after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Every major power expected motion. Germany unleashed the Schlieffen Plan, a massive right hook through Belgium meant to knock France out of the war in weeks. France answered with Plan 7, a belief that spirit and attack Ellen Weil could overcome anything. Britain sent a small but professional army across the channel. On paper, everything pointed to movement, speed, and decision. In reality, something unseen waited to stop them. The battlefield of 1914 was ruled not by generals on horseback, but by machines. The machine gun, perfected just years earlier, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery had grown deadlier, more accurate, and capable of killing from miles away. Barbed wire, cheap and easy to deploy, could halt entire formations. These technologies favored defense overwhelmingly, but the men who planned. The war did not yet understand this truth, so armies advanced as they always had. They marched into walls of fire at Mons, at the Marne, at Ypres. Soldiers discovered that courage could not outrun bullets. Waves of infantry were cut down in minutes. Officers blew whistles. Men went over the top, and entire units vanished under machine gun fire they could barely see. The ground drank blood faster than strategy could absorb lessons. And yet, both sides kept pushing, believing that one more attack, one more sacrifice would break the enemy's will. It never did. By late 1914, exhaustion replaced optimism. After the German advance was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the race to the sea. Each move was met with another countermove. Each attempt to go around the enemy ended with more resistance. Finally, from the Swiss border to the North Sea, the front froze, not because anyone wanted it to, but because no one could move to survive the storm of steel soldiers dug. At first, they were shallow scrapes, temporary shelters against shells and bullets. But as the weeks turned into months, those scrapes became ditches, and those ditches became systems. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, communication trenches twisting like veins through the earth, dugouts reinforced with wood and steel, sandbags stacked by trembling hands at night. The ground itself became a weapon and a refuge. Trench warfare was born from necessity, not design. A man standing in the open was a dead man. A man underground had a chance, but that chance came at a terrible cost. Life in the trenches was not heroic, it was enduring. Mud swallowed boots, sometimes men. Rain turned the battlefield into a graveyard that refused to stay buried. Rats grew fat on the remains of the dead. Lice spread disease and madness. The smell of rot, cordite, waste, and fear never left. Soldiers slept inches from corpses, sometimes with the bodies of friends used as part of the trench wall, and still they waited. Waiting became the rhythm of war. Waiting for orders. Waiting for bombardments, waiting for the whistle that meant attack or death. Days of boredom shattered by seconds of terror. Artillery shells screamed overhead, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, pounding the earth until it shook like a living thing. Men developed shell shock, their minds broken by a violence they could not escape and could not fight back against. Yet offensives continued. Generals believed that massive artillery barrages could destroy enemy defenses. They believed that if enough shells were fired, the wire would be cut, the machine guns silenced, the trenches erased. So they planned great assaults. The Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, millions of shells, millions of men. The reality was cruelly repetitive. Artillery often failed to destroy deep dugouts. When the shelling lifted, defenders climbed back to their positions, machine guns ready. Attacking troops advanced slowly across cratered landscapes, tangled in wire, exposed to fire. Gains were measured in yards. Losses were measured in thousands. Trench warfare persisted because no solution could break the balance. Technology created the stalemate, and technology struggled to end it. Early tanks broke down or became easy targets. Aircraft were still primitive. Communications were slow, unreliable. Commanders could not react quickly enough to exploit breakthroughs, and breakthroughs rarely survived the counterattack that followed. Every advantage was temporary. The war became a contest of endurance. Which nation could suffer longer? Which economy could produce more shells? Which population could absorb more G? Brief. Trenches were not just lines on a map. They were physical expressions of a deeper deadlock, political, industrial, and human. And in those trenches, the war stopped being about flags and borders. It became about survival. A soldier did not fight for grand strategy when he crouched in the mud. He fought for the man beside him. He fought to make it through the night. He fought because retreat meant death and advance often meant the same. Trench warfare stripped war of illusion. It revealed it as something slow, grinding, and deeply personal. World War I turned into trench warfare because the world changed faster than the minds directing it. Industrial power outpaced imagination. Firepower overwhelmed movement. Defense crushed offense. And once armies dug in, the cost of leaving the trenches became greater than the cost of staying. So the trenches remained year after year. Men lived and died in the same narrow strips of earth. Seasons passed. Empires weakened. Millions were lost. And when the war finally ended, it was not because the trenches had been conquered by courage alone, but because new methods combined arms, tanks, air power, and sheer exhaustion finally cracked the deadlock. But the scars never faded. The trenches of World War I stand as a warning. Written in mud and blood, when technology races ahead of wisdom, humanity pays the price. And when war loses movement, it does not become quieter or cleaner. It becomes slower, crueler, and far more human in its suffering. That is why World War I turned into trench warfare. Not by plan, but by consequence. At the moment Europe marched toward war in 1914, its armies were dressed for the past, but stepping into the future. Generals carried doctrines shaped by centuries of mobile warfare, where speed, maneuver, and decisive engagement determined victory. Cavalry still existed not as a symbol, but as a serious tool of war. Infantry tactics assumed that disciplined formations, courage, and momentum could overcome resistance. Maps were drawn with arrows sweeping confidently across borders. Yet beneath this familiar surface, The nature of killing had fundamentally changed, and no parade ground tradition could protect soldiers from what industrial-age weapons were about to unleash. The most devastating transformation came from firepower. The machine gun was not new, but by 1914, it had reached a level of reliability and lethality that rewrote the rules of combat. A single crew, properly positioned, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute with terrifying accuracy. What once required dozens of riflemen could now be done by a handful of soldiers operating a mechanical weapon that did not tire, did not hesitate, and did not feel fear. Against this, the old logic of movement collapsed almost instantly. Advancing troops trained to walk forward in formation or rush across open ground found themselves mowed down before they ever saw the enemy. Artillery completed the destruction of mobility. Industrial manufacturing allowed nations to produce guns on a scale never seen before, firing shells packed with high explosives, shrapnel, and later gas. These weapons could strike targets miles away, turning roads, rail junctions, and open fields into death zones long before soldiers arrived. Movement, once the key to survival, became an invitation to annihilation. An army on the march was visible, predictable, and vulnerable. Every step forward meant exposure to steel raining from the sky, often fired by men who never saw the faces of those they killed. This new firepower was not balanced by equivalent advances in protection or communication. Soldiers wore cloth uniforms and leather boots, not armor. Helmets, when they appeared, were designed to deflect shrapnel rather than stop bullets. Radios were rare and unreliable, leaving commanders blind once a battle began. Orders moved slowly, carried by runners who were often killed before they arrived. In this environment, maneuver required coordination that simply did not exist. Even when a unit managed to advance, it could not adapt quickly to changing conditions, making it easy prey for defenders with pre-sighted guns and overlapping fields of fire. The industrial age also transformed logistics, and with it the scale of warfare. Railways allowed entire armies to be moved and supplied with unprecedented speed. Millions of men could be concentrated along narrow fronts, supported by endless streams of ammunition and equipment. But this concentration came with a price. When so many soldiers faced each other across limited terrain, there was nowhere to go. Any attempt at wide maneuver ran into another mass of troops, equally well armed and equally entrenched. Mobility was strangled not just by weapons, but by density, by the sheer weight of men and machines packed into the battlefield. Barbed wire, a simple invention born of industrial efficiency, became one of the most effective tools for killing movement. Cheap, strong, and easy to deploy, it turned open ground into a maze of invisible traps. Soldiers advancing under fire were slowed, tangled, and forced to stop exactly where machine guns were most lethal. Cavalry charges, once symbols of shock and speed, became impossible. Horses panicked under shell fire, and riders were cut down long before they reached enemy lines. The romance of movement died, screaming against coils of twisted metal. Military doctrine lagged behind reality. Officers had been educated in academies that emphasized offensive spirit, believing that morale and courage could overcome any obstacle. They spoke of willpower as if it were armor. Industrial weapons proved otherwise. Bravery did not stop bullets. Discipline did not deflect shells. Entire battalions advanced exactly as ordered and were destroyed exactly as predicted by physics. Yet the belief in movement persisted, fueled by tradition, pride, and the fear of admitting that the foundations of warfare had shifted beyond recognition. As early battles unfolded, armies learned through catastrophe. Initial offensives bled men at an unsustainable rate. Roads filled with wounded, hospitals overflowed, and casualty lists stretched into the tens of thousands within weeks. The battlefield itself began to change shape. Craters replaced fields, trees were reduced to splinters, villages vanished under bombardment. Moving through this environment became slower and more dangerous with every passing day, further reinforcing the advantage of staying still rather than advancing. Defense, once considered passive and inferior, became dominant. A soldier who stopped moving and dug into the earth suddenly gained protection from the very forces that made movement deadly. The ground absorbed shrapnel. Walls of dirt blocked bullets. Trenches reduced a man's visible profile to a helmet and a rifle barrel. Industrial weapons that slaughtered advancing troops were far less effective against enemies hidden underground. This simple act of digging neutralized much of the attacker's technological advantage, creating a brutal equilibrium. Industrial warfare also changed the psychological experience of battle. Movement exposed soldiers not only to physical danger, but to constant uncertainty. A man advancing across open ground had no control over where death might come from. It could arrive as a bullet, a shell, or a blast he never heard. Staying in one place, however miserable, offered a sense of predictability. Trenches B. Came grim sanctuaries where soldiers could brace themselves, where survival felt marginally possible. The instinct to stop, to hold, to endure was as much psychological as tactical attempts. To restore mobility repeatedly failed because the underlying imbalance remained. Attacks relied on massed infantry advancing into zones saturated with industrial firepower, without a way to suppress machine guns, cross barbed wire quickly, or communicate effectively under fire. Movement could not be sustained. Each failed assault reinforced the lesson that advancing meant dying, while staying put meant living a little longer. Over time, this logic became embedded in the behavior of armies, shaping not only strategy but the very rhythm of daily life at the front. By the end of 1914, the illusion of a fast, mobile war was gone. Industrial-age weapons had stripped movement of its protective value and turned the battlefield into a place where exposure equaled extinction. The earth itself became the only shield against the machines humanity had built. Soldiers no longer marched toward victory, they burrowed into survival. What followed was not a deliberate choice, but an adaptation forced by steel, smoke, and mathematics. As armies learned that in this new age of war, the safest path forward was often straight down into the ground, where motion ceased and endurance began, where the future warfare waited in. Silence, measured not in miles advanced, but in hours survived, days held, and the tea. Hidden fragile space between life and the next shell falling just beyond the parapet, the machine gun and artillery were the twin engines that transformed World War I from a war of movement into a grinding stalemate. Before 1914, generals planned for battles in which courage, speed, and maneuver could decide the outcome. The shock of a cavalry charge, the weight of an advancing infantry line, the precision of coordinated attacks, these were the tools of victory. But when the armies of Europe collided, they discovered that the battlefield had changed faster than any doctrine. Machine guns and artillery did not just kill, they dictated the terms of engagement, forcing armies to adapt in ways that no strategist had imagined. The machine gun in particular was a revelation and a horror. Early in the war, officers had little understanding of its potential. They assumed it was just another rifle, albeit faster. But in practice, it was a weapon of overwhelming lethality. A single Maxim gun, properly emplaced and protected, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. It could cut down advancing soldiers in waves, mowing through entire companies before they reached the enemy line. The terrain itself became an accomplice to death. Fields, open meadows, and gentle slopes turned into funnels, guiding men directly into the fire. Any notion that bravery alone could carry a line became obsolete almost overnight. A soldier who stepped into the open was a target, a statistic waiting to happen. Attrition guns did not act alone. Artillery transformed the battlefield into a landscape of constant terror. By 1914, heavy guns could fire shells with astonishing speed and range, delivering high explosives that shattered not only men but earth, trees, and buildings. Indirect fire meant that soldiers could be destroyed without ever seeing their attackers. Artillery barrages softened defenses, destroyed supply lines, and created mud-choked craters that made movement all but impossible. Each shell was a reminder that no matter how disciplined or courageous a soldier's fate could be decided by a steel projectile traveling faster than the eye could track. In the open, mobility was suicidal underground or behind fortifications. Survival was marginally possible. The combination of machine guns and artillery created a paradox. Offense became extraordinarily dangerous, while defense became vastly more viable. An attacking force, no matter how large or determined, faced a gauntlet of fire that could not be easily neutralized. Trenches, which began as shallow shelters, quickly evolved into complex defensive networks because the firepower of these weapons made staying exposed intolerable. Soldiers learned that the only way to survive artillery barrages and machine gun fire was to dig in, creating layers of protection that slowed and often stopped the advance of the enemy. The battlefield shifted from one of movement to one of attrition, where the land itself, reinforced with earth, wood, became as deadly as the weapons above it. The effectiveness of these defensive technologies also exposed the limitations of contemporary tactics. Generals continued to plan attacks as if the battlefield were still a place where massed infantry could close with the enemy. Waves of men were ordered to advance across open ground, carrying rifles and bayonets into a hailstorm of bullets and shells. Casualties were staggering. Entire units could be decimated in a matter of minutes, yet the orders continued, reflecting both a lack of understanding and a rigid adherence to outdated doctrines. The human cost was immense, and yet it was not merely a matter of numbers. The psychological toll on soldiers was profound. Facing a machine gun nest or an incoming artillery barrage was an exercise in helplessness, where the mind struggled to reconcile courage with survival instincts that screamed to retreat or hide. Artillery was not only deadly, it was psychologically transformative. Soldiers lived under the constant roar of guns that never slept. Night or day, the landscape shivered with explosions, the ground quaking beneath their feet. Barrages were sometimes designed to last for hours, breaking not just lines but spirits. The combination of noise, fear, and destruction created conditions that led to what later became known as shell shock. Minds, like bodies, could be battered by modern weaponry, and soldiers learned quickly that in order to survive, they had to find shelter and dig deeper, reinforce the natural human tendency to seek protection from overwhelming firepower. Machine guns and artillery also created new dynamics. In the planning and execution of battles, commanders could no longer rely on rapid advances or flanking maneuvers alone. Attack had to be meticulously coordinated with artillery support, yet even then, the margin for error was razor thin. A miscalculation of timing could expose infantry to uncut wire or untouched machine guns, transforming an already dangerous advance into a massacre. The scale and lethality of these weapons forced strategy into incremental steps. Entire battles were measured in yards gained, not miles, and victories were defined less by decisive movement and more by the endurance of men against impossible odds. The dominance of defense also changed the very geography of war. No longer could armies sweep across fields and forests without consequence. Terrain became a weapon as commanding positions and natural obstacles amplified the lethality of machine guns and artillery. Hills, ridges, and riverbanks were fortified and turned into death zones. Trenches, bunkers, and dugouts multiplied, creating labyrinths that not only protected soldiers but also funneled attacking forces into kill zones. The earth itself became a partner in the defensive advantage shaped in Russia, fed by the constant need to survive in an environment dominated by industrial firepower. Logistics and industrial capacity further magnified the impact of these weapons. The sheer number of machine guns and artillery pieces deployed along the Western Front meant that both sides were locked into a technological stalemate. One could not outgun the other easily because production capabilities allowed both nations to field vast arsenals. This parity reinforced the defensive advantage, making offensive operations extraordinarily costly and often futile. Industrial-scale death had replaced maneuver as the primary factor in battle outcomes. Soldiers and commanders alike understood that the front lines were not easily broken and that survival required adaptation to this new reality. The human dimension of facing machine guns and artillery cannot be overstated. Soldiers learned through experience what textbooks could not teach. Crawling across open ground under fire was a near certain sentence to death. Standing in a trench, enduring bombardments, repairing defenses, and surviving counterattacks became acts of daily heroism. The war was no longer about rapid conquest, but about withstanding the relentless pressure of superior firepower. Courage became redefined not as the act of charging forward, but as the ability to endure, to survive, and to continue fighting in the face of near insurmountable odds. As the war progressed, innovation attempted to overcome the dominance of defense, but the balance remained largely intact. Early tanks were cumbersome and unreliable. Artillery tactics evolved with creeping barrages and small unit infiltration tactics emerged, yet machine guns and artillery continued to shape every engagement. The front remained static because these weapons ensured that the cost of movement was almost always catastrophic. The battlefield had been transformed into a deadly chessboard where each move had to be calculated with precision, and even then, luck played a cruel role. The psychological, tactical, and physical realities imposed by machine guns and artillery forced armies into a defensive mindset that would define the conflict. Trench systems, reinforced positions, and deep dugouts were not innovation of choice but necessities imposed by the dominance of firepower. Mobility, once the hallmark of military success, became a liability. Attacks were reduced to carefully orchestrated operations aimed at small gains, while the ever-present threat of death from bullets and shells dictated the pace of war. Entire strategies were rewritten to account for these technological realities, shaping not only the conduct of battles, but the very culture of armies and the lives of millions of men confined to the killing fields of the front. When the first months of World War I revealed the deadly effectiveness of modern weapons, armies quickly discovered that traditional strategies of maneuver and rapid victory were no longer viable. Early offensives, meant to decide battles within weeks, instead became disaster, bleeding men at an alarming rate and leaving commanders scrambling to adjust. What had been envisioned as swift campaigns turned into desperate attempts at survival. Soldiers advancing across open ground under fire were cut down in waves, officers shouting orders that no one could safely follow. Commanders learned too late that the battlefield itself had become a lethal barrier, forcing armies to confront the harsh reality that they could not simply move forward without devastating consequences. The failure of these early offensives was not merely a tactical disappointment. It had profound strategic and psychological effects. Armies, once confident in their ability to achieve decisive results through speed and aggression, found themselves trapped in a cycle of repeated attacks against fortified positions. Morale, which had been buoyed by patriotic fervor and faith in leadership, began to waver as soldiers witnessed the futility of courage in the face of machine guns, barbed wire, and relentless artillery. Each failed assault reinforced the lesson that survival required adaptation, and that the old doctrines of mobility could no longer guide the conduct of war. As casualties mounted, both sides sought ways to minimize exposure while maintaining their positions. The first instinct was to dig. At first, these were shallow trenches, temporary shelters intended to provide minimal protection from bullets and LL fragments. Soldiers crawled into these rudimentary ditches using whatever materials they could find: wooden planks, earth, sandbags to reinforce their meager defenses. The act of digging was both practical and psychological. It allowed men to feel some control over their environment in a conflict where almost everything else was beyond their influence. Survival required staying low, staying hidden, and preparing for the inevitability of bombardments that could erupt without warning. As the weeks passed, these shallow shelters evolved into complex trench networks. Frontline trenches were supplemented by support and reserve lines, all connected by communication trenches that snaked through the battlefield like arteries. Dugouts were reinforced with timber and steel, providing some protection from the relentless artillery fire. Trenches were no longer temporary. They became permanent features of the landscape, reshaping the battlefield and imposing a static structure on operation. What had begun as a defensive necessity transformed into a strategic reality. Armies were now anchored to the ground, and the idea of movement was subordinated to the need to hold positions and endure attacks. The human experience of living in trenches was brutal and relentless. Mud swallowed boots and legs, turning even minor movements into exhausting labor. Rain and snow created conditions that made trench floors resemble quagmire, and soldiers struggled to keep their feet dry, knowing that trench foot could become a debilitating condition. Disease spread quickly, aided by the close quarters and lack of sanitation. Lice, rats, and vermin thrived in this environment, feeding on the living and the dead alike. Sleep was fragmented and interrupted by the constant roar of artillery, the whistle of incoming shells, and the cries of the wounded. The trench was a place where daily life and imminent death coexisted in a fragile balance. The psychological impact of trench warfare cannot be overstated. Soldiers were subjected to continuous stress, both from the ever-present threat of death and from the monotony of waiting. Days could pass with little more than inspection, repair of defenses, and foraging, only to be shattered by sudden and violent attacks. The unpredictability of bombardments and raids created a sense of helplessness, undermining morale and straining mental resilience. Shell shock, or what we now understand as combat-related PTSD, emerged as a widespread consequence of this unrelenting exposure to violence and fear. Men adapted by becoming hypervigilant, by seeking shelter at all costs, and by developing routines that allowed them to retain some semblance of control in a world dominated by chaos. The need to dig in was also reinforced by the sheer scale of firepower confronting soldiers. Machine guns, capable of cutting down dozens in seconds, made open ground deadly. Artillery, firing with increasing intensity and accuracy, could destroy even well-prepared red formations in minutes. Early attempts to cross no man's land, the exposed terrain between opposing trenches, resulted in catastrophic losses, teaching commanders that offense required extraordinary preparation and often yielded minimal gains. Even when artillery barrages were intended to clear the way for infantry defenders, frequently survived in deep dugouts and re-emerged to repel attacks. This created a cycle in which each offensive became a lesson in the advantages of defense and the necessity of trench construction. Barbed wire played a central role in making trenches indispensable, simple, and inexpensive. It created deadly obstacles that slowed attacking forces, leaving them exposed to concentrated fire. Soldiers had to carry wire cutters, probes, and ladders, attempting to breach obstacles while under continuous fire. The labor-intensive process of crossing these obstacles ensured that every attack involved prolonged exposure to danger, reinforcing the lesson that survival depended on remaining behind protective barriers whenever possible. The physical presence of barbed wire transformed the battlefield into a defensive landscape where movement was dangerous, and static positions offered the best chance of life. Trench warfare also dictated the rhythm of strategy. Commanders, confronted with the difficulty of breaking entrenched lines, began to adopt attritional tactics. Battles were no longer measured by rapid gains or decisive victories, but by the endurance of and the incremental erosion of enemy forces. Artillery barrages became central to offensive plans, intended to weaken defenses before infantry advances. Coordination between units required careful timing and communication. Yet the unpredictability of combat often rendered even the best laid plans ineffective. Success was rare, temporary, and often came at enormous cost, reinforcing the defensive orientation imposed by the trenches. The adaptation to trench warfare also affected military engineering and planning. Engineers constructed networks of trenches with zigzags to reduce the impact of enfilading fire. Communication trenches allowed the movement of messages, supplies, and reinforcements while minimizing exposure. Observation posts were established to monitor enemy activity and direct artillery fire. Barbed wire was systematically deployed to cover approaches, often in multiple layers. Trenches were connected to bunkers, underground shelters, and artillery positions, creating a layered defensive system that made frontal assaults exceptionally costly. Every aspect of trench construction was shaped by the need to survive and to hold ground against superior firepower. Over time, soldiers became intimately familiar with the landscape of the trenches. They learned to read subtle signs of enemy activity, to identify the safest routes, and to improvise defenses. Daily routines included repairing walls, digging drainage, and reinforcing weak points. Training and discipline were maintained not only to prepare for attacks but to preserve life in a place where a single misstep could be fatal. The trenches became a microcosm of the battlefield itself, a system of survival, adaptation, and resilience in an environment dominated by technological lethality. The failure of early offenses combined with the deadly efficiency of defensive weapons ensured that trench warfare became the defining feature of World War I. Armies were no longer free to maneuver at will. They were anchored to the earth, their actions constrained by the need to minimize exposure and survive. The human body, the landscape, and industrial weaponry converged to create a form of warfare that was slow, grinding, and relentless. Soldiers endured unimaginable hardships, yet their experience of living, fighting, and surviving in the trenches was also a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to endure in the face of overwhelming adversity. The technological stalemate of World War, I created a battlefield where neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the war became defined by static positions and incremental gains. By 1915, it had become painfully clear that traditional tactics based on movement and decisive engagement were no longer sufficient. The industrial age had introduced weapons of such scale and lethality that open field maneuvers became suicidal. Machine guns, long-range artillery, and barbed wire made offense exceedingly costly, while entrenched positions offered significant protection. Every attempt to advance met with predictable disaster, and the human cost was staggering. Soldiers learned quickly that victory was not about maneuver or speed, but about endurance and the ability to withstand punishment. Artillery, in particular, dominated the battlefield and reinforced the stalemate. Shells rained down for hours, sometimes days, destroying the landscape and anyone caught in the open. Barrages could flatten villages, craters, and forests, transforming the ground into a moonscape where movement was nearly impossible. Soldiers in the open were annihilated before they could reach enemy lines, while those in trenches survived to fight another day. The effectiveness of artillery in both offensive preparation and defensive suppression meant that static positions became the norm. Armies dug deeper, fortified stronger, and waited for opportunities that rarely came, solidifying the stalemate that would define the Western Front for years. Machine guns compounded the problem by making open ground lethal. A few strategically positioned crews could stop entire regiments in their tracks. Waves of infantry advancing across no man's land were cut down before reaching barbed wire obstacles, which themselves slowed progress and exposed soldiers to fire. Officers attempted to adapt with new formations and tactics, but the fundamental imbalance between offensive forces and defensive firepower persisted. Courage, discipline, and sheer numbers were insufficient to overcome the mechanical efficiency of these weapons, and attacks were repeatedly repulsed with catastrophic losses. The battlefield had shifted to one where defense was exponentially stronger than offense, creating a protracted and grinding struggle. Barbed wire, though simple, was devastating in its effect on movement. Thick, coiled, and layered, it created barriers that could not be rushed without severe casualties. Soldiers attempting to breach wire entanglements had to stop, cut, and clear obstacles while under continuous fire. The process of crossing these deadly obstacles slowed advances to a crawl and ensured that every step forward exposed men to concentrated machine gun fire. Barbed wire, combined with artillery and entrenched rifle positions, made the idea of maneuver obsolete along much of the front, transforming the battlefield into a static, fortified landscape. Each side reinforced its defenses in anticipation of inevitable attacks, solidifying the stalemate. The stalemate was also reinforced by communication and command limitations. Rapid decision-making was nearly impossible due to unreliable telegraphs, runners under fire, and the general chaos of combat. Once troops were committed to an attack, their fate depended on timing, coordination, and the unpredictability of enemy resistance. Orders sent from command often arrived too late or were impossible to execute under fire, leading to disjointed assaults and high casualties. The inability to coordinate effectively meant that even when breakthroughs seemed possible, they were rarely exploited, leaving armies locked in static positions with little hope of decisive maneuver. The human experience of the stalemate was defined by monotony punctuated by terror. Soldiers spent long periods maintaining trenches, repairing fortifications, and performing guard duties punctuated by sudden bombardments, raids, and attacks. The psychological toll was immense. Men lived with constant stress, anticipating death at any moment. Sleep was scarce and interrupted by the incessant roar of artillery and the screams of the wounded. The routine of trench life, combined with the unpredictability of combat, created conditions in which both physical and mental resilience were continuously tested. Shell shock and other stress-related conditions became widespread, reflecting the psychological burden of enduring a war with no clear path to victory. Efforts to break the stalemate drove innovation, but progress was slow and costly. New tactics, such as creeping artillery barrages, infiltration by small specialized units, and the early use of tanks, were attempts to restore mobility, yet each innovation faced limitations. Tanks were slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery. Infantry tactics required careful coordination with artillery, but communications remained a challenge. Even the most carefully planned operations often produced limited gains at enormous human cost. The fundamental imbalance between offense and defense persisted, ensuring that the stalemate endured despite technological experimentation. The static nature of trench warfare also influenced strategic thinking. Commanders shifted from seeking rapid, decisive victories to planning attritional campaigns, aiming to wear down the enemy over time. Battles were measured in weeks, sometimes months, with objectives limited to small sections of territory. Casualties numbered in tens of thousands for gains often measured in yards. The war became a test of endurance, industrial capacity, and the ability to sustain operations under continuous pressure. The front lines themselves became enduring symbols of the stalemate networks of trenches, barbed wire, bunkers, and observation posts stretching across hundreds of miles, marking the limits of movement and the dominance of defensive power. Logistics played a critical role in maintaining the stalemate. Industrial-scale production of ammunition, artillery, and machine guns ensured that neither side could achieve a decisive technological advantage. Railways delivered men, supplies, and reinforcements to the front, enabling armies to replace losses and sustain positions indefinitely. The result was a grinding conflict where attrition became the primary metric of success, and where endurance often mattered more than tactical skill or battlefield innovation. The stalemate reflected not only the balance of weapons but also the capacity of nations to support continuous, large-scale military operations. The physical environment of the trenches reinforced the stalemate. Trenches were dug in zigzag patterns to minimize the effects of enfilade fire and bombardments. Communication trenches allowed movement between front and rear positions while minimizing exposure. Dugouts and bunkers provided protection from artillery, but limited flexibility in responding to enemy attacks. Barbed wire and minefields covered approaches, channeling attackers into predetermined kill zones. Every feature of trench construction was a response to the lethal effectiveness of defensive weapons, and every innovation reinforced the static nature of the front. The battlefield had become a system of endurance and protection, where movement was constrained by necessity and survival dictated strategy. The stalemate also created a psychological dynamic that shaped the conduct of war. Soldiers, facing overwhelming defensive firepower, adapted to their environment. By learning to move cautiously, dig deeply, and conserve energy, morale became a function of endurance rather than aggression, and acts of bravery were often measured in the ability to survive prolonged exposure to danger. Leadership focused increasingly on maintaining cohesion, discipline, and readiness under static conditions. The war became a daily negotiation with death, mediated by earthworks, sandbags, and the fortifications that technology and necessity had imposed. Over time, the stalemate had broader consequences for the nature of World War I. It defined the rhythm of the conflict, shaping strategy, tactics, and human experience. Battles were no longer campaigns of rapid movement. They became drawn-out engagements where gains were minimal and losses immense. Industrial weapons dictated the pace, geography, and limits of action, while human adaptation ensured that soldiers survived long enough to continue fighting. Trench warfare, attrition, and technological parity created a war without decisive movement where endurance, fortification became the primary determinants of survival and ultimately of strategic outcomes. The persistence of stalemate shaped not only the military dimension of the war, but also the social and cultural perception of conflict. Soldiers and civilians alike came to understand that victory would not be swift or glorious. The grinding, static nature of the front, combined with the high human cost, altered expectations and reshaped narratives of heroism, sacrifice, and endurance. The stalemate imposed by technology and circumstance became a defining feature of World War I, a reminder that industrial age weapons had fundamentally altered the conduct of warfare, and that mobility, once the hallmark of military success, had been subordinated to the imperative of survival in a world dominated by firepower. World War I became less a war of movement and strategy and more a battle of endurance, where human will and resilience determined the course of the conflict. Once the reality of industrial age weapons became apparent, commanders and soldiers alike were forced to confront the stark truth: survival was often more important than victory. and holding the line mattered more than advancing. Endurance replaced initiative as the defining feature of combat. The war shifted from being about clever maneuvers or decisive breakthroughs to being about who could absorb more punishment, maintain morale, and sustain the ability to fight. In a world dominated by machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire, the soldiers who lived and died in this environment understood that endurance was not merely physical, but profoundly psychological. Each day spent in the trenches demanded patience, courage, and an ability to cope with continuous stress. The daily grind included repairing and reinforcing positions, digging new trenches, standing guard, and patrolling dangerous terrain. Yet the monotony of these tasks was punctuated by moments of extreme terror, sudden artillery, barrages, sniper fire, and enemy raids that reminded men of their fragility. Living under such conditions required constant vigilance and mental fortitude, as the threat of death could arrive at any moment, often without warning. The physical demands of endurance in the trenches were immense. Soldiers contended with mud that swallowed boots and sometimes entire limbs, rain that turned trenches into quagmires, and cold that seeped into the bones. Trench foot, frostbite, and disease were constant threats, compounded by unsanitary conditions. Food was often scarce and of poor quality, making physical sustenance a daily struggle. Despite these hardships, soldiers learned to adapt, developing routines that allowed them to survive and maintain their readiness. Endurance became a skill in itself, a combination of physical resilience, mental adaptation, and the ability to maintain discipline under conditions that could easily overwhelm even the strongest individual. The stalemate of the front lines reinforced the need for endurance. Because neither side could achieve decisive breakthroughs, armies were locked in protracted positions for months or even years. Trenches became semi-permanent homes where soldiers lived, ate, and slept, all while preparing for attacks that might never come. Daily life involved repairing fortifications, maintaining weaponry, and preparing for the inevitable bombardments. Soldiers became intimately familiar with their terrain, learning every mound, trench, and dugout. This intimate knowledge was essential for survival, as even minor missteps could mean death. Endurance was tested not only by enemy fire, but by the constant exposure to danger, discomfort, and uncertainty. The psychological dimension of endurance shaped both leadership and morale. Commanders understood that the ability of soldiers to withstand the pressures of trench life often determined the success of operations. Leadership focused on maintaining cohesion, providing routines, and offering small comforts where possible. Letters from home, moments of rest, and brief diversions became critical tools for sustaining morale. Soldiers developed camaraderie, relying on one another for support in a world where isolation and fear could be debilitating. Trust and mutual dependence became essential, as each man's survival often depended on the actions of those around him. Endurance was thus both an individual and collective endeavor. Endurance also shaped tactics and strategy. The dominance of defensive weapons and the lethality of the battlefield meant that attacks could rarely achieve decisive results. Instead, operations were designed to wear down the enemy over time, exploiting small opportunities while minimizing losses. Artillery barrages, infantry advances, and coordinated assaults were calculated to test enemy positions, inflict attrition, and maintain pressure. The human cost was immense, but the measure of success was often not territorial gain, but the ability to sustain operation. Endurance dictated the tempo of battle, the allocation of resources, and the very structure of the front lines. Industrial production magnified the importance of endurance on a national scale. Nations with the capacity to produce weapons, ammunition, and supplies in massive quantities could maintain their armies in the field despite staggering casualties. The war became as much a contest of logistical endurance as of military skill. Railways, factories, and supply lines ensured that men and material could be replenished, allowing armies to continue fighting when it seemed impossible. This industrial endurance mirrored the human endurance on the front lines, linking the ability of nations to sustain conflict with the ability of soldiers to endure its immediate horrors. The physical and psychological pressure of endurance were compounded by the environment of the trenches. Constant shelling, mud, disease, and vermin created a world in which survival was never guaranteed. Soldiers learned to anticipate dangers, to take cover, and to conserve energy. Trenches were dug with care, enforced against bombardment, and organized to facilitate movement and communication while minimizing exposure. The act of digging, repairing, and fortifying became a form of defense, a method of asserting control over an environment dominated by destructive forces. Endurance, therefore, was as much about preparation and adaptation as it was about passive survival. The protracted nature of trench warfare also created a unique rhythm of conflict. Days, weeks, and months passed with soldiers performing repetitive tasks, punctuated by moments of extreme danger. Patrols, raids, and bombardments required bursts of energy and courage, but the overall struggle was one of sustained effort. Soldiers measured time by routine and survival rather than by victories or territorial gains. Endurance became a daily reality where the ability to maintain function, discipline, and morale under constant threat was as crucial as any weapon or tactical maneuver. Endurance shaped culture and identity among soldiers. Shared hardship fostered bonds of loyalty and mutual reliance, creating a sense of collective resilience. Humor, storytelling, and small acts of kindness became tools for coping with the relentless stress of trench life. The experience of enduring together, of surviving impossible conditions, forged connections that transcended rank and nationality. Soldiers came to understand that personal bravery was inseparable from the ability to persist, to adapt, and to support one another in a WW1 dominated by industrialized death. The broader implications of endurance extended beyond the front lines. Civilian populations, economies, and national governments were drawn into the contest of sustaining war effort over years. The ability of nations to endure in terms of production, resources, and morale directly influenced the war's progression. Military strategy increasingly relied on protracted campaigns, attrition, and careful management of human and material resources. The nature of World War became one in which endurance at every level, individual, unit, and national was the decisive factor. Success was measured not by dramatic victories, but by the capacity to survive, adapt, and continue fighting under conditions that tested the limits of human stamina. Endurance also redefined the concept of heroism. Traditional notions of daring charges and bold maneuvers were replaced by the quiet courage of survival. Holding a trench under constant fire, repairing defenses in the midst of bombardment, and maintaining composure in the face of death became acts of extraordinary valor. Soldiers were celebrated not only for their offensive achievements, but for their ability to withstand, persist, and continue the fight despite overwhelming adversity. Endurance became the defining virtue of the war, shaping both individual identity and collective memory. The experience of enduring in World War I reshaped military thought, tactics, and doctrine. Generals and strategists recognized that wars could no longer be conducted purely through mobility and decisive battles. They had to account for the psychological and physical limits of soldiers, the lethality of modern weapons, and the structural advantages of defense. Military planning incorporated the realities of attrition, logistics, and sustained operations, reflecting the centrality of endurance to both tactical and strategic considerations. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.